markets work, how they reach these efficient outcomes. At in equilibrium, the marginal benefit of the last unit that's being bought and sold is equal to the marginal cost of production for that last unit. And we're maximizing producer and consumer surplus. We're reaching what economists call allocated efficiency, that we have the best use of all the resources that is possible. And the reason why this is the case is because the consumers are taking into account all the costs in this market. Because they're the ones paying for these goods and services, they're going to make sure they're not going to purchase a good or service unless the marginal benefit, the marginal cost to them, the price they're paying, is equal to the marginal benefit they're getting from that last unit. And likewise for producers, they're not going to use resources to produce a certain good unless they're able to get back a price that's equal to the marginal cost. They're not going to get a price that's lower than that and lose money on it. So we end up with the best usage of resources. We're meeting consumer needs as well as possible. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there are third parties that are affected by transactions that are not involved in it. When that's the case, we don't end up with the efficient amount being produced by the market. We end up with either overproduction or underproduction, because the producer and the consumers are only taking into account the costs that affect them and the benefits that affect them. They're not taking into account the costs and benefits that affect other people. So we're going to explore that first. What are externalities in this chapter? How does this move the market out of equilibrium? How does this cause us to reach less efficient outcomes than we could in a market without externalities? And then we'll look at some policy responses that governments and individuals can do to reduce or to completely get rid of externalities. Yeah, so first, looking at externalities, what that does to economic efficiency. Then we'll look at the Coase theorem. The Coase theorem is a private solution where you have individuals, consumers, firms, whoever, getting together and solving the externalities themselves. Then we'll look at government policies to deal with externalities. One of them is going to be a tax on each unit of the goods. So we'll use what we talked about earlier in this class. We'll use those same supply and demand curves, the same tax, shifting up the price to see how we can move a market back into equilibrium. And then we'll briefly touch on the 4 types of goods. So the example your textbook uses for externalities is the classic example. So it's what I'll work with through most of this class, or most of this section, is what is the best level of pollution? What's the optimal level of pollution? So while no pollution may be a great goal, it may be great for the environment, but it's not good for people. Because most modern conveniences we have result in some pollution. So like electricity, climate-controlled rooms, building, a building is going to cause some pollution. So there's going to be some optimal level of, spoiling the environment that is going to be efficient. That's going to be optimal for people, so they have some sort of comfort and convenience. While no pollution isn't going to be optimal, neither is unrestrained pollution. Or consumers, regular people, firms, whoever can pollute just as much as they want. That's not going to be efficient either, because we live in the environment. You don't want to live in a place where the smog is so thick you can't see the sun. Anyone here from Pittsburgh? Okay, at least some Yinzers in the class. Back in like the 60s and 70s, like the soot was so bad from the steel mills. You guys know about that? That was like, everything was like covered in like the soot, like people go outside for lunch and they get like dirty from it. Like that's probably not optimal. Just looking at that, we can say, we probably shouldn't have that much pollution. So there's some level that's going to be optimal, where we still have a good environment that we can enjoy and that's healthy, but at the same time, we can still enjoy these modern conveniences and low-cost goods. no one's goal is to create pollution. Maybe some Bond villain or I don't know, bad guy like Superman might want to just create pollution. But in the real world, it's an unintended byproduct of the production of goods or the consumption of goods. We're intending to make something that's useful, but in the process of doing that, we spill out some chemicals or something that results in pollution. Makes the environment not quite as clean and as great as it could be or was before. Now, if pollution only affected the person who created it, then we wouldn't have a problem with pollution. In that case, they would bear the full cost of their action, so they would produce an optimal amount, as much as they were willing to deal with. The problem is, pollution affects everybody. So that one person only bears a fraction of the cost. So they're gonna end up producing more pollution than they'd be willing to deal with themselves. So this is an example of an externality. So we have other people that are not directly involved in the production or the consumption of a good or service that are being affected by it. So it's kind of like an economic side effect. So when there are externalities in the market, we have a problem with using market forces to reach the optimal output of products. We end up, when there is an externality that's a cost to society, the producer doesn't bear the full cost of these externalities. They don't bear the full cost of, in this case, pollution. So they're going to end up producing more goods than is optimal. They'll end up polluting too much compared to what they would do if they bore the full cost of pollution. You guys think of some examples of externalities, products or services that result in externalities. So we have third parties being affected even though they're not involved in the transaction. Pollution gives you a lot of options. There's a lot of different industries that pollute.
Like /agriculture.
How would that affect someone outside of the transactions?
Like climate change and deforestation.
Yeah, there you go. This is why I hate 8 a.m.s, because I don't know if you guys don't get it or just don't want to talk because it's too early. So here's some examples. Farm smells, and who drives by Valewood Farms in the summer? Like right below campus, when think that way. You smell all the manure from the cows. Imagine living next to it. So you have them like producing dairy products. You're not producing them, but when you're driving by, you're getting this negative side effect of a bad smell. And you see people, they're building like developments near farmlands, some places, and the people complain about the smells from them because shockingly, you move next door to a farm and farms smell like farms. Another is cigarette smoke. This isn't the externality isn't being created by the producers in this case. It's being created by the consumers actually consuming the products. Do you guys remember when restaurants had smoking sections? Or am I too old? Okay. There's nothing worse than I remember going to Pizza Hut as a kid and they had like a little smoking section in there and getting stuck at the table right next to it. And you're like, well, we're just in the smoking section anyway. There's an externality that you have to deal with the unpleasant smell, potential for secondhand smoke damage, whatever. Getting these negatives from other people that are involved in the transaction. Construction noise is another one. I lived in DC, it's like they were always doing construction in my neighborhood. So you're being woken up at like 7 a.m. every morning. I also lived right on the Potomac in Arlington. It's like just outside of DC. And the planes flying into Reagan would like go right past, like right over the Potomac, right past my apartment. So you'd hear them like all night long. traffic jams from Dunkin' Donuts drive-thru. This is a very specific example from my hometown in Williamsport, where on this busy strip, there's a Dunkin' Donuts, and you have traffic backed up for like 2 or 3 blocks from all the people going through the drive-thru to get their coffee in the morning. Has anyone been down to Altoona trying to go to like Target or Walmart on a Saturday around lunchtime? And you get all that traffic from Chick-fil-A. I went at 2 p.m., I think it was 2 weeks ago. Had to pick something up at Target, and I got caught in like a half-hour of traffic. I was so pissed off because I was like, oh, I'll just do this real quick. Again, I'm not going and buying Chick-fil-A. I'm not helping produce any of the Chick-fil-A sandwiches, but I'm being negatively affected by the sale of these goods. But there's also positive externalities. A lot of the focus is on negative externalities, but there are some positive externalities out there. So one example one of my grad school professors gave was a really nice vintage car. He said he used to drive this like really slick convertible when he was younger, and he said that there was a positive externality that people would see that car, be like, hey, that old car looks cool. They get some enjoyment from it. So he said he should have charged people like 25 cents to get the benefit from that externality. Education is another big one. All things being equal, it's better to live in a world where people are more educated, where people have more experience in school, so they've learned more concepts. They're able to apply critical thinking in a lot of different areas. People with higher levels of education tend to commit fewer crimes. And they, in general, it's a better society to live in. The final example is free software that has positive externalities. This idea talked about by the Nobel laureate Jean Tirole. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics in, I believe, 2014. The reason I include his name there, so I remember to tell you guys, I went to a conference when I was in grad school, and it was for like grad students to go, and they had a bunch of Nobel laureates present. Like, we got to like talk to them and stuff outside of it. It was a really cool experience. It was over in Italy, so there's like a ton of free wine, which is also awesome. At the last dinner, Jean Tirole, who's one of the Nobel laureates that spoke, gave everyone like a certificate and like took a picture with them. Well, for mine, he was holding it like this, so you could see the screen or see like what was printed on there. But it looks like he's flipping me off in the photo. So I can say I've been flipped off by a Nobel laureate. So let's dig in and start looking at some examples of externalities and how they limit the market's efficiency. So, like I said, competitive markets maximize economic surplus. So both consumers and producers are as well off as possible in these competitive markets. The problem with externalities is it causes private and social costs to differ. So we typically assume in competitive markets that private costs, that the supply and demand curves, so our demand curve here, our marginal benefit, we assume that's what the producers are facing. That's also the societal marginal cost. We're assuming that all of the costs that are being borne by the production of these goods are being placed upon the producer. Likewise, for the demand curve, the marginal benefit, we're assuming that the marginal benefit from the purchase of these goods or from their use is entirely being borne by the consumers actually producing them. When there's externalities, this is not the case. So the social costs or the social benefit, this is going to all of society. So the parties to the transaction and other people that aren't being involved in the transaction. The private cost is just, and the private benefit are just those that are borne by the parties in the transaction. So typically in our hypothetical competitive markets, private costs and social costs are the same. So buyers and sellers are both taking into account all of the costs and all of the benefits from the production and the sale of these goods. When the private cost and the social cost differs, that means there's externalities. Other people are bearing costs or getting benefits that are not involved in the transaction. That means the parties don't take the full count or the full cost and the full benefit into account. Because of that, we don't end up in this perfectly efficient market, this optimal allocation of resources. That knocks us out of that, and we need to find some way to get us towards equilibrium, or else there's going to be some dead weight loss, some waste in the economy. So electricity production, as we'll walk through this as an example, because even though it's incredibly important for a society, it allows a modern economy to function and gives us, allows us to charge our cell phones so we can have some fun. It allows us to play video games, watch TV. Allows us to have lights so we can do stuff after dark. Has all these benefits for people and for like the firms that use them for production of goods. Despite having all these benefits and being a great thing, it also causes pollution. So other people that are not involved in the transaction, that are not involved in the production or the use of electricity, face some sort of cost. They face this pollution. So in this case, in the market for electricity, we have the sellers. They have increasing marginal costs to produce electricity, meaning upward sloping supply curve. And buyers face decreasing marginal benefits, a downward sloping demand curve. Both of these groups, through their interaction in the market, generate the market supply curve and market demand curves for electricity. Fancy way of just saying, I'm not really sure why they include all this information now that we've been working with supply demand curves, basically saying that we have a market. So when firms produce electricity, they bear a lot of the cost of production. So they pay for the buildings, they pay for the equipment that's being used, they pay for the fuel to actually generate the electricity, they pay for labor, all these sorts of things. These are their private costs. So they use all these types of costs to make their decision about how much electricity to produce. They're only concerned with the cost that they actually have to pay for, which makes sense. When we personally engage in transactions and we do things, we think of the costs and the benefits to ourselves. We don't think very much about the costs and the benefits to others. But what firms aren't taking into account is the cost of pollution. Because the pollution mainly affects third parties. It does affect them, but obviously electricity producers are a very small part of all of humanity. So they're bearing a very small cost of this pollution. So because of this pollution that they're not taking into account, the social cost of producing electricity is higher than the private cost to those electricity producers. So the social cost is going to be all of the private costs and then all the externalities that are not being taken into account. So if we look at this market, here we have our demand curve. As an example, we're assuming that consumers are bearing all of the benefits of consuming electricity. That there is no externality that someone else who's not using electricity is getting a benefit from. Here we have supply curve S1. This is the marginal private cost. So this is the marginal cost curve for producers of electricity. This is the land, the equipment, the facilities, the labor, all those things that they're taking into account. The things you would see on their balance sheet or their income statement. I forget kind of stuff. But you would see those on their financial statements. All the things they take into account. This curve, S2, is the marginal social cost. So this is the cost of all of society for electricity production. It's all the same cost that that was in this private marginal cost curve. So all the things that electricity producers take into account. And it includes the externalities. In this case, mostly pollution. So the optimal level of production for society is where the marginal social cost, where this curve crosses the demand curve. So you have this price here, P efficient, and the quantity being produced there, Q efficient. But the problem is, firms aren't going to take into account the marginal social cost. In fact, for them, they're unable to figure out what the marginal social cost is. They can't measure, using dollars and cents, the cost of pollution. Maybe they can try to estimate it, and we have You have either economists doing it and trying to get journal publications. You have people that work for like government regulators trying to estimate it so they can design better regulations. But it's not like we can look on a financial statement or look on some document and see what the marginal social cost is, or the cost of pollution in this case. So I want to talk about this before we see it. Yeah, there we go. What they're going to produce at is just the cost that they can see and take into account. So they'll look using this marginal cost curve or just the private cost. So they'll produce the market equilibrium will be where that curve, marginal private cost curve, crosses the demand curve. So right here. So we end up with the market quantity being produced, which is higher than the efficient quantity being produced. Again, they're not taking into account the additional cost of pollution, so they end up producing too much. And they produce at a lower price. Had the price they produced at, and they sold on the market at been higher up here, efficient, we see a lower quantity being produced. But because they're not able to take into account the cost of pollution, they're producing too much and selling it at too low of a price. What we end up seeing in this market is deadweight loss. And this deadweight loss is a little different than what we worked with before. Deadweight loss is on this side, this triangle. But again, it's the same thing as before. The difference between what's being produced in the market and between what's actually efficient, what should be produced. So in this case, like in the past, it was a shortage of goods, like too few were being produced compared to equilibrium. Here we're producing too many compared to equilibrium. So the difference between what is efficient and what is actually being produced is going to be this deadweight loss. So now we're using too many resources in the production of these goods and services because producers are not taking into account the added cost of pollution. There's externalities present, which they are not and they cannot include in their calculations of what their marginal cost is and how much to produce. So for society would prefer less being produced, and less being consumed, which implies a higher price. Yeah, okay, I like that line. So the cost to society of producing this last unit is greater than the benefit to society. So if we trace up what's being produced in the market up to the social marginal cost curve or supply curve, we end up with the marginal social cost being greater than the marginal benefit to society because of this added cost of pollution that they're not able to take into account. And I do want to drive home, it's not that firms are being assholes and they're polluting too much because they're rubbing their hands together and saying, we're not being charged for this. They don't know what the marginal social cost is. Most people would say that there's too much pollution right now, but it's very hard to get pretty much anyone to agree how much pollution above the optimal we have right now, and actually estimate what the cost of that additional pollution would be. So it's very difficult to know these things. Yeah, so basically, when there's a negative externality, when there's a cost that firms are unable to take into account in producing or consuming a good or service, so even if it's like the cigarette example where it's the consumption that causes the externality, when that externality is negative, too much of the good or service is going to be produced in market equilibrium. So the market equilibrium that I spent every class so far talking about how great it is, when there's externalities, it breaks down and it's not great. Since it's Thursday, we'll end there for the day and we'll